Well, this is Dr. Stan here at Radio Liberty, coming to you from the hills overlooking beautiful and picturesque Monterey Bay, and bringing you the news behind the news, the story behind the story. Hoping to convince you that reality is usually scoffed at and that illusion is usually king. But in the battle for survival of Western civilization, it's going to be reality, not illusion or delusion, that will determine what the future will bring. And I need to remind you the views expressed here are not necessarily those of the owners, management, staff, sponsors, or supporters of the station you're listening to. They happen to be my views. And, well, for the next hour, they're going to be the views of Joel Skousen from World Affairs Brief. Hi, Joel. How are we doing?
I'm just fine, Dr. Stan. Good to be with you.
What are we going to be talking about today?
Well, there's so much going on in the world. It gets hard each week to put it into the World Affairs Brief. We've got, the ATF gun-running scandal. We've got deficit games being played by both sides. Battle for the Arctic heating up. Russia building a new nuclear aircraft carrier. China demanding a role in the IMF. Texas objects to international interference and the death penalty, and Air Force Times still saying U.S. is flying combat missions in Libya. Isn't that incredible?
Well, where do we start?
Well, let's start with the ATF gun-running scandal. Is this going to be another Watergate? It's the question a lot of people are asking. It's certainly big enough, but it's doubtful due to support by the press. But the administration is certainly scrambling desperately to avoid full disclosure about its mushrooming gun-running scandal, wherein the ATF, under multiple secret operations, knowingly allowed gun smugglers to buy automatic weapons at gun shows and smuggle them into Mexico and Honduras. It was designed to look like a sting operation, but no sting ever took place. Just incredible, and nor were there any arrests ever intended. The entire operation was designed to provide a false flag trail of gun running that would deliver to the Democrats new impetus for gun control, blaming the Second Amendment for the ease at which illegal guns could be purchased in the U.S. and shipped around the world. Well, what I want every American to know is that this is no isolated incident. It's typical of dozens of illegal operations the U.S. engages in every year to create wars, engage in drug dealing, justify dirty tricks on foreign nations, and undermine U.S. sovereignty. There are thousands of U.S. operatives who have virtually no principles and will do whatever the government tells them to do. A few, like ATF Director Melson, will be taken down as a scapegoat, but the higher-level directors will never be brought to justice. Well, the ATF's gun-running project went bad after one of the smuggled guns killed a U.S. Border Patrol agent, and the Justice Department tried to cover up the linkage. According to Fox News, that gun used to kill Agent Brian Terry had been sourced not to Mexico, but to a gun store in Phoenix that was actually part of and cooperating with a federal investigation into arms trafficking. However, U.S. agents did not stop the sale or the transfer of that gun to the cartels that killed Terry. And Gun Owners of America, my favorite gun lobby, has more details yet.
But I think what's important to bring out is the fact that the gun store owners didn't want to transfer the guns. They were ordered to allow these guns to be purchased by people they were suspicious of, so they got into the hands of certainly of the drug cartels. And in essence, our own BATF intentionally, willfully, and knowingly armed the drug cartels. And of course, if you didn't have an armed drug cartel, how could you have a war on drugs? But go right ahead.
Well, that's right. The key to this is that the ATF already knew and had a long list of gun smugglers. They could have arrested them. They had all the evidence. But they always say to the people who protest, well, we've got to find evidence. They don't tell them they already had the evidence. And so this was clearly going, and I wouldn't doubt, if we knew all the facts, that the ATF went and had their agents whisper in the ears of these smugglers, we're open for business, come by. GAO said on the night of December 14th, Border Agent Terry Bryan was shot and mortally wounded near Nogales, Santa Cruz, Arizona, 10 miles north of the Mexican border. 4 suspects were taken into custody, including one who was shot and transported to the hospital.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. Well, this is Dr. Stan. Our guest this afternoon is Joel Skousen, and he's talking about this gun runner controversy. And, of course, this is a program set up by the BATF to actually allow the transfer of weapons to the drug cartel in Mexico. And, of course, it's illegal for American gun stores or gun shows to transfer weapons down there. I mean, they're supposed to check on the people. But the BATF ordered these gun stores and the gun people at the gun shows to release the guns because they say, oh, we want to track them down there to Mexico. It's a sting operation. We're going to arrest the people. But they didn't arrest them. They let all these, we're talking about hundreds and hundreds of guns, turned over to these ruthless organizations down there who murdered literally hundreds of people, tortured them to death. They find mass graves down there with 100, 150 people in the horribly mutilated bodies, horribly tortured. And where are they getting the guns? Why, at least some of them are coming through the American BATF. But nobody really complained too much until one of these guns was used to shoot an American border guard. And then, of course, when it came out that this was one of the guns that the BATF had allowed, of course, to get into the hands of the gun cartel. Will you pick up the story, Joel?
Well, there's all kinds of cover-up involved after Agent Terry had been shot. 2 months after the murder, the U.S. Attorney's Office deported the three of the four witnesses to the murder who may have participated in it, who were arrested at the scene. Despite being arrested at the scene, it was announced that no evidence tied the three to the shooting of Agent Terry. This is amazing, said GAO. Should not these illegal aliens be kept in custody as witnesses? At best, they are material witnesses. At worst, they're perpetrators who assisted in the murder of Agent Terry. To date, no one had been charged with the murder. The FBI has been uncharacteristically tight-lipped about the investigation, except to assure that Terry was not killed by friendly fire of fellow agents. Well, in my opinion, not only are here at GAO, but also the whistleblowers, that because these Mexican citizens have potential knowledge as material witnesses, they should not be deported. Instead, should be kept in protective custody. Well, 2 semi-automatic Kalashnikov rifles were found at the scene. When traced, of course, it was discovered they went to American Gun Shop in the Phoenix area. And as you correctly said, this was part of the Operation Fast and Furious. These weapons had not only been traced to this gun shop once, but they'd been traced there before. In other words, this wasn't the first time these guns had been sold to gun smugglers.
We're arming the best enemy. What the BATF can find, we're arming our enemies. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel Skousen is just talking about how the policy of the BATF is to allow the transfer of weapons to the drug cartel. And it wasn't just 1 or 2 weapons that got away. It was a whole flock of them. Do we have any idea how many weapons the BATF allowed to be transferred down there to the drug cartel? And we do know this thing goes all the way up to the top of the Justice Department, because Assistant Attorney Generals, several of them, have frankly lied to Congress about this. That's perjury. They should go to jail. Nobody's been fired. Nobody's been accused. This is always the way it works in government. Cover up. Doesn't matter how many people are killed. We had, of course, 9/11. How many people were fired because of dereliction on the part of our intelligence agency? Not one. In fact, George Bush went to the CIA and congratulated them on a fine job after 3,000 or almost 3,000 Americans had been killed. Nobody was fired for allowing this to happen, and now we find out about this Operation Gunrunner, whatever you call it, and suddenly everything is being done to cover it up. And the whistleblowers, the only people, they're getting into real trouble, forced into early retirement. They're being persecuted for daring to tell Congress the truth. You pick up the story there, Joel.
Well, the ATF is claiming that it was poor planning, sloppy fieldcraft, and even sloppier management. But the tragedy had been predicted by some of the agents beforehand. Worse, both street agents and responsible supervisors said within the ATF that they tried to prevent this kind of outcome and were overruled by higher management.
Well, then why isn't anybody fired? Unless this is official U.S. policy, they would be fired. If it's an official U.S. policy, of course, they're not going to fire them, just going to try to stonewall. But go ahead.
It's just like drug importation, you know, and drug control agents with dogs go, get very upset when they sniff drugs about these Mexican trucks coming through the border that have been sealed and assured that there's no drugs in it. When the agents go to their supervisor to say, we've got to open up this truck, even though it's been sealed, they say, no way. We called Washington, and they say, let them through. Well, in one case, Darren Gill, the ATF attaché in Mexico City, went over the head of the Phoenix special agent in charge, and it ended up ending his career. Gill was forced into early retirement December 2010, 2.5 weeks after the murder of Brian Terry. Gill was removed, at least in part, because he insisted that pursuant to treaty and established protocol, the Mexican government should be notified of this operation. It was not. The decision to remove Gill and keep the Mexican government in dark was approved at the highest levels of the Justice Department. So this is a whistleblower, Darren Gill, who's fingering the highest levels in the Justice Department. There are now 5 separate but connected accusations leveled by current and former employees of the ATF against the ATF and DOJ officials in what has been dubbed the Project Gunwater scandal. Here's a synopsis. First, that these are the charges leveled. First, that they intentionally allowed perhaps as many as 3,000 firearms to, quote, walk across the U.S. border to Mexico with the purpose of boosting the statistics of seized firearms with American commercial provenance. Second, provenance means they came from America, therefore we can blame this on the American gun shows. Second, that they instructed U.S. gun dealers to proceed with questionable and illegal sales. Third, that they intentionally withheld information about U.S.-sanctioned gun smuggling from the Mexican government. And it wouldn't have done any good. The Mexican government's in league with the U.S. on these drug and smuggling things, and always have been, at least in terms of the CIA drug pipeline. Fourth, that one of the rifles the ATF allowed to be smuggled in Mexico was involved in the death of Agent Brian Terry. And fifth, that high-level managers of ATF and DOJ, which is the Department of Justice, are now in tandem with the FBI involved in covering up ATF and DOJ culpability in items 1 through 4 by various means, including the unlawful threatening of current serving ATF agents with personal knowledge of the case, threatening to fire them if they talk to Congress about it. Well, eventually these charges came to the attention of U.S. Senators Jeff Sessions of Alabama and Chuck Grassley of Iowa. Through the new media, was learned of the existence of potential whistleblowers from its own sources within the ATF. The senators got in touch with the whistleblowers so that they could be afforded some protection, according to the Whistleblower Protection Act, because they were being prosecuted and persecuted by the ATF itself. As the story breaks and gets wider coverage, more whistleblowers are bound to come out. This story just surfaced in Florida by the Examiner, a special report by David Codrea. He said, breaking news, sources claim ATF's Tampa special agent in charge walked guns across the border, not literally, this is an ocean border, to Honduras, part of Operation Castaway. Virginia O'Brien, special agent in charge of Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Explosives in the Tampa Division, ran a gun-running investigation that was walking guns to Honduras using the same techniques and identical tactics to Fast and Furious, Operation Gunrunner, that was reported this week. According to court documents, a group of defendants, well, this is the Attorney General, who mentions all the people involved in this Operation Castaway, and he mentions one special agent in charge, O'Brien, which was listed by the U.S. Attorney as involved in this operation. He said, court documents say that Special Agent O'Brien was previously the special agent in charge of the Phoenix Field Division and was later promoted to Deputy Assistant Director of ATF. So he had to know about this Phoenix operation. Then he mysteriously stepped down and took a lower position in Tampa. Now, how often does that happen? Whether the allegations of our source refer to the ongoing Operation Castaway remains at this hour unclear, but our sources are certain that O'Brien was the one who allowed the walking of straw-purchased firearms to Honduras using the same failed strategy as the Phoenix Field Division from which he came. This is confirmed as accurate, the correspondent continued. There are emails in existence where O'Brien has advised those involved in Tampa that do not report their walked guns because Tampa is not part of the Southwest Border Project Gunrunner. So how many other divisions? My guess is there are similar operations in Texas and New Mexico, and by focusing only on the Phoenix operation, the Justice Department hopes to limit the investigation. Representative Darrell Issa, chairman of the House Representatives Oversight Committee, is running the investigation in the House. ATF Director Ken Nelson told congressional investigators that he had discovered other law enforcement agencies had critical information that they did not share with their targets, and that he had been ordered by the Justice Department not to respond to congressional inquiries. Nelson is desperately trying to save himself by saying he didn't know about the specific orders to let straw buyers walk off with guns until after the controversy erupted. I'm not believing that for a minute, but this guy is being offered as a sacrificial lamb, and he's trying to save himself. Reuters noted that the operation dubbed Fast and Furious has put the Obama administration on the defensive, provoking questions about who knew what and when within the Bureau and the Department of Justice. Things are getting hot for Attorney General Eric Holder, said Michael Walsh of the New York Post. Don't look now, but the real action in Washington this week isn't the partisan wrangling over the debt ceiling, but something literally even more incendiary. Operation Fast and Furious, which seems about to explode in the face of Attorney General Eric Holder and maybe other administration officials as well.
No, of course, Holder's in trouble because, of course, he has actually perjured himself. He's actually told Congress that he had no knowledge of this at all, and now it's come out that he did. And several of his assistant attorney generals are guilty of perjury. So why are we going after some baseball player who injected himself with testosterone? We're going to try him for perjury, but not high government officials who have been arming the drug cartel. Suddenly the baseball player harmed himself. Suddenly the drug cartel has killed hundreds and hundreds of, if not thousands of people. And people high in our government are covering up and lying about it. I would think that would be a much more important issue of perjury than trying a baseball player, wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Well, if Representative Issa and Chuck Grassley note in their letter, had the other agencies shared information, theoretically the goal of the post-9/11 revamp of intelligence enforcement agency was to share information with one another. But the FBI wasn't sharing information they had about these Mexican criminals with the ATF. Now, I actually think what's happening here is that they're claiming that they didn't share information so as to give ATF an excuse to, quote, not to have known that they should have arrested these guys. But the New York Post asked the question, so if the identities of the Mexican criminals were known to the feds, what was the point of Project Gunrunner? Why is Holder so desperately trying to stonewall by withholding hundreds of documents for Congress? Well, law-abiding gun owners and dealers think they already know, with the Obama administration wedded to the fiction that 90% of Mexican gun cartels, guns Mexican cartels use originate here in America. They don't, and many suspect that Fast and Furious was a backdoor attempt to smear domestic gun aficionados as part of the stealth effort on gun control. Is this what Obama was referring to when he said, quote, I just want you to know that they're working on it? He was saying to Advocate Sarah Brady in March, we just have to go through a few processes to get more gun control under the radar. Unfortunately for the administration, this one's now out in the open. Interesting that Representative Issa told Ken Nelson in April, we're not conducting just a concurrent investigation with the Department with the ATF, but also of the Department of Justice.
And the only people who can investigate the Department of Justice is Congress. And if these people lie, it's perjury. It's a violation of law. And I would think there should be an outcry, why are we going to indict, and trying to indict the baseball players when we're not concerned about high government officials lying and transferring weapons to people who've killed people. I mean, that's at least at best involuntary manslaughter. But where certainly is the outcry? Well, we're getting a little bit from Fox News, and I think it's so important. This is a vitally important story. We need to get the information out. Gun Owners America is doing a great job, and so is Joel. You need to get the information, start talking about it to everyone you know. Joel, go right ahead.
So, as a wrap-up, is this going to turn out to be a Washington scandal, the biggest since Iran-Contra or Watergate? Well, my answer is don't hold your breath. There'll be lots of political fireworks over this, but here in America, we've long since passed the time when higher authority can be expected to be called to account for the secret and evil acts of government. As I say, this government operates on the idea of protection, of immunity, both here on earth and in the heavens in the end, which they can't do, obviously. But that's how they operate, and these people act as if they have immunity, and they do. Well, moving on to the deficit games, the debt ceiling will be raised again, and no significant cuts in spending will become law. That's my prediction. They may be promised, but few will go into effect. That's the bottom line. Everything else to the contrary, as reported by the media, is just political grandstanding. Here's how the game works. Deficits are bad, but that's only an idea in people's minds. The consequences of going back to a balanced budget requiring much higher taxes or the cutting of benefits is painful in comparison to deficits, because that's the magic of deficits. People just keep spending and the tax bill doesn't arrive. And when they falsify the rate of inflation, it doesn't look like inflation's going up, and people expect to have a certain amount of inflation anyway. And so in essence they hide it. Now they can't hide it forever because in fact they have to keep people from feeling the pain, and there's huge amounts of this deficit and derivatives and many other things that are going to blow up in their face eventually unless they give us a war first to hide it all or to give them an excuse to start over. But that's the reason people and politicians love deficits. They allow the world to keep spending and receiving without paying the price till it's too late and collapse comes. But even when that looms on the horizon, and this is interesting, Stan, no one wants their benefit cut. You could tell Social Security, Medicare, pensioners, everyone, all right, we're going to collapse in next week unless somebody starts to give up the benefits. Anybody volunteer? Nobody. They'd want their benefits to the very day of collapse. That's the mentality we have in America today.
But
no one's willing to work for the benefit of the good.
But unfortunately, Joel, it is going to collapse. There is no way they can prevent it from collapsing. They may be able to put it off a few months and maybe even a few years, but the whole system is coming down, whether we want it to or not. You can't get out of debt by spending more money, and that's exactly what they're doing.
Well, I've long said that they'll give us a war before that it will allow that to happen. And the reason I say that is be obvious that somebody has to pay the price, and they don't want to have to pay the price. With a war, they get to hide behind the war to say, and believe me, if a war came, nobody would be worried about who's paying off any creditors or any debtors. They'd just say, save us. And that's exactly what's going to happen.
Well, but I'll tell you what, there are going to be an awful lot of angry old people, when they lose their Social Security, when they lose their Medicare, or when they lose all these benefits, and more and more people are laid off, as the economy continues contracting. And then, of course, along with the contracting economy, we begin to get hyperinflation, and then they destroy the value of their currency. I mean, some of these people are going to be pretty angry. At least I hope they're angry. If this doesn't get them angry, nothing will. Because
well, what can they do, though? That's the question. What can they do? If they get angry, the government just simply says, well, we have to do something. And what does the government do? They have to print more money. That's the only solution left. They can't raise taxes when you have a declining economy. Where's the money going to come from? Sure, you can tax the rich for a while, but then all of a sudden the investment money starts to dry up.
Hold that thought. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is just pointing out the impossible situation we're in. Nobody wants to give up their benefits. The trouble is that there's no way they can be financed, and we're doing everything with borrowed money. We're giving money to Israel. We have to borrow the money. We're giving money to Egypt. We have to borrow the money. We are giving money to Tunisia. We have to borrow the money. We're buying the bombs to kill the people in Libya, and we're funding the revolution in Syria. We have to borrow. We're doing it all on borrowed money. We put out $36 billion to finance dictators throughout the year. How long can you continue borrowing money? Can you borrow your way into prosperity? Can you get out of debt by spending money you don't have? Go right ahead, Joe.
Well, that's exactly right, Stan. So Republicans and Democrats will finally come together with another 10-year deficit reduction program So why 10 years? Why not guarantee cuts next year? Because a 10-year extended promise allows them to do two things. One, it adds enough cuts together over the years so that it looks like something big and significant, but it isn't compared to the total revenue and the total deficit over 10 years. If you compare the two, a $10 trillion deficit reduction over $100 trillion doesn't mean anything. And two, they can sign off on promises that they will never have to fulfill. Who remembers the 10-year deficit reduction plan of President Bush? No one. And it's irrelevant besides because no future Congress is bound by those promised reductions. When it comes to the actual cutting that has to be done each year, the constituents of those benefits start howling. The politicians pull back from the brink for fear of their political life. So the big game now is for establishment Republicans like House Speaker John Boehner, who has pledged no new taxes, is to accept revenue increases that they can say don't amount to direct tax increases, like cutting subsidies. And I'm for that. This may be a legitimate differentiation. The opposition, of course, will claim that they are raising taxes. Another problem for high-profile Republican congressmen is who have vowed not to raise the debt ceiling, but feel obligated to back the Republican budget in Congress. This got Michelle Bachmann into trouble this week as the media picked up on this and turned it into a political football. Back in April, Bachmann voted for Republican Paul Ryan's budget plan, which did not eliminate budget deficits. It simply cut the deficits. Some $50 billion instead of, the illusory $10 billion that Obama was proposing. Despite much deeper cuts than the Democrats were willing to concede to, the Ryan budget still would have added $6 trillion in added debt over that same decade. So most of the political maneuvering going on has to do with making sure that the other party gets the blame for either shutting down the government or raising the debt ceiling or cutting spending sufficient to make a lot of people angry. The Democrats are having a heyday shutting down Minnesota state government services, hoping to inflict the maximum amount of pain on citizens so that the public outcry will force the Republicans to allow tax increases. That's the way this game is played. In fact, no one needs to shut down all of the state government. Minnesota could have simply stopped paying out certain benefits and allowed the rest of the state to operate within limitations. Instead, taking a cue from Bill Clinton, the Democratic government in Minnesota shut down everything so as to exacerbate the crisis. Obama's capable of doing the same thing with the federal government. Even a default on U.S. debt is not a necessary conclusion from the failure to raise the debt ceiling. In fact, it would be a great excuse to cut all foreign aid, shut down unneeded bureaucracies, which cost the country billions to operate. But they won't do that. They will default so as to cause a crisis to force people back into voting for a debt increase. Now, because of the possibility of stalemate in Congress is near certain, we're getting all kinds of signals out of Washington, Stan, that they may be preparing to pull a rabbit out of their hat, with Obama declaring that he has the power based on an obscure no repudiation of debt clause in the 14th Amendment. This was a specific problem to post-Civil War Reconstruction, where Southern Democrats wanted to have Congress pay their war debts but repudiate the Northern debts. It was solved by the Congress passing the 14th Amendment, meaning that you can't repudiate any of the debts. Well, it wasn't meant to bypass Congress's constitutional control of the purse. Senator John Cornyn warned President Obama on Sunday not even to consider interpreting the 14th Amendment to bypass Congress and raise the debt without its approval. That's crazy talk, he says. It's not acceptable for Congress and the President not to do their job and to say somehow that the President has the authority to do this by himself. This got started by Secretary Tim Geithner telling reporters that the Constitution's language could support the President's raising the debt limit without congressional approval. That's nonsense, but it's typical for the globalist that he is.
Well, people really don't understand that certainly great civilizations in the past usually have been destroyed by excessive debt. This is what happened to the British Empire. They just had so much debt, the whole thing collapsed. But time and time again, the same thing has happened. You have excessive wars, you have excessive government benevolence, and of course eventually the whole thing collapses financially, and it's coming here. Inflation's coming, ladies and gentlemen, the cruelest tax of all.
While the storm clouds gather far across the sea,
Well, Joel, you go right ahead, but I can see the inflation. Well, we're already having a 10% inflation, and I'm sure it'll be up to 20% by next year. And it doesn't take very long before we destroy the life savings of the senior citizens and everyone else. We destroy their pensions, their annuity, their CDs. Everything that's attacked to the dollar, they could destroy half or two-thirds of the value of our currency and end up impoverishing our people.
But, when inflation occurs slow enough, which they've, been doing, except in the early 70s when Carter was, inflation peaked over 10%. When they do it slowly enough, people can slowly adjust, and that's why they've gotten away from this for a long time. It helps, of course, to suppress the actual rate of CPI and play like it's about half of what it is. But nevertheless, when it starts getting over 10%, inflation really gets to be a heavy burden because very few people have an automatic mechanism to raise their wages. Only the self-employed can kind of raise prices. But people on fixed incomes or salaries, especially in a recession where businesses can't afford to pay more, are really in a hurt locker. That's why we call that an inflationary recession, and it's going to happen again, I'm afraid. Well, let's switch topics now and talk a little bit about the battle for the Arctic as it is heating up. Oil and mineral deposits in the Arctic have become confirmed lately, and Russia's making claims to everything it can up there. Because of the near-constant ice cap, northern nations haven't bothered to precisely define boundaries. Before the days of GPS, it was hard to read a compass accurately there, let alone drive in survey stakes. Now a new Cold War is brewing, and Russia's moving in troops that threaten to make it a hot one. The 7th ministerial meeting of the Arctic Council in May looked to be its normal mundane affair, with its focus on signing a new search and rescue treatment under the new chairmanship of Sweden. But the atmosphere in Greenland was electrified by the first visit ever to the forum by the United States, courtesy of Hillary Clinton.
Hold that thought here. Well, this is Dr. Stan, and Joel is talking about the battle for the Arctic, because, of course, there's a great deal of oil and natural gas there. And Russia, of course, is moving troops up into that area to make sure that it will have a claim to as much of the oil and natural gas as possible. But before we get on with the story, Joel, I want you to tell our listeners how they can get in touch with you, how they can get a copy of the World Affairs Brief, and hopefully subscribe to it. It's an excellent source of information, and certainly Joel's website, worldaffairsbrief.com, is a place I go to every morning. Go right ahead.
Well, thanks, Stan. The World Affairs Brief can be seen on my website, worldaffairsbrief.com. And people can get a free sample issue, what we're talking about, by emailing me at editor@worldaffairsbrief.com. Also on my website are showcased the various books that I've written about preparedness and security. The top seller is Strategic Relocation, North American Guide to Safe Places. It's in its 3rd edition, brand new edition, about 3/4 new material compared to the old edition. It covers everything from foreign retreats to all of detailed analysis and colored maps of all the areas in the United States and Canada. My big work, the biggest work, is my 700-page The Secure Home, everything from A to Z about high-security construction and self-sufficiency, generator, solar, and other forms of energy and protection. And the last book is How to Implement a High-Security Shelter in the Home. It's an architectural plan book on how to do a safe room in an existing basement. All 3 of these books are available at Radio Liberty.
And that by calling 1-800-544-8927. That's 1-800-544-8927. And certainly Joel's books are among our very best sellers, especially now. People know something's seriously wrong, and they're trying to make preparations for the very, very real difficult times that lie ahead. Well, let's pick up with a story about what's happening up in the Arctic as far as the Russians now are beginning, of course, to move troops into that area to guarantee their claim on the oil and natural gas there. And what's this about Greenland?
Well, the U.S. showed up once, and even though they're a member of this commission there on the Arctic, they showed up and actually sent a representative there, and the message is clear. The U.S. is putting itself at the center of the debate about the future of the far north at a time when new oil and mineral rush is on the way. A few weeks earlier, 2 nuclear-powered submarines were sent by the U.S. to patrol 150 miles north of Prudhoe Bay, Alaska. Meanwhile, Russia, also on the 8-Nation Council about the Arctic, basically it's the council of all the nations that, in fact, the U.S. is only part of it because of Alaska, which is on the Arctic. Canada is a major portion of it. Russia, of course, is, and the Scandinavian countries. Russia was happy to push off the agenda any idea that countries such as China could gain observer status. China is ever hungry for more resources, despite the fact that it already has the majority of rare earth elements on the Earth. The Navy move with submarines comes as Russia is said to have increased missile testing in the region. And Russia's defense minister said the military is deploying 2 Army brigades to Russia's base at the town of Murmansk, close to the border with Norway. And Norway is moving its main military base to the far north to counter the Russian move. So this doesn't look good at all. I don't think it's going to turn into a shooting war by any means, but certainly everybody's jockeying for position to take advantage of the oil up there and the mineral rights. Meanwhile, China has started to woo countries such as Greenland, which are rich in rare earth minerals needed for mobile phones and other high-tech equipment. China, of course, wants a monopoly on everything. Canada, with the second largest presence in the Arctic, was disturbed when Arthur Chilingatov, a veteran Russian polar explorer, placed a flag on the Arctic seabed in 2007. He told reporters his mission was to show the Arctic belonged to Russia. Well, Canada took exception to the Russian move, seeing it as a provocation. And there's a professor of political science at the University of Calgary who said that Vladimir Putin was talking about the need to establish a zone of peace in the Arctic, but he sees contrary actions to that, as typical with Russia, notwithstanding the public statement of peace and cooperation issued by the Arctic states. The strategic value of the region is growing. As this value grows, each state will attach a greater value to their national interest in the region. The Arctic states may be talking cooperation, but they are preparing for conflict. I think that's a good way to finalize that. Well, another preparation for conflict is the news this week that Russia is going to build a nuclear aircraft carrier. Russia has one conventionally powered aircraft carrier, the Admiral Kuznetsov, which was finished in the early 1990s. In 2010, it's interesting, Stan, that the Russian defense minister denied emphatically that there were any plans to build any new aircraft carriers other than the one that they had. But you can never trust the Russians, what the government says. One of the Russian newspapers pointed out this week that Russia will build the first of its nuclear aircraft carriers by 2003. And
I was going to have a hard time getting it built by 2003.
2023.
Oh, 2023, okay.
I misspoke.
That's all right. I do the same thing all the time.
We will start designing the Russian aircraft carrier in 2016, so that by 2018 we can start construction, said the head of the Russian Naval Service. Well, this will tend to impact my estimate of when the Russians intend to strike the West. If this is an accurate timetable for design and construction, which isn't certain at all, the Russians are very deceptive about hiding weapons programs, and I don't believe if they've decided to build nuclear weapons, they're going to wait till 2016 to start design. I just don't believe it. Other sources have them indicating they plan on building 4 of these nuclear carriers, which could take longer. It also takes a long time to train crews on how to operate these floating cities. On the other hand, when does any nation ever have enough weapons to start a war? This could be a ruse along the lines of the Chinese military strategist Sun Tzu, who said all war is deception. He consolidated the strategy of always feigning weakness before the war. So while I do believe the Russians are intending to build nuclear-powered aircraft carriers, I think they're going to be on a much more accelerated schedule than this. You know, China and Russia are in the news almost every week now in terms of maneuvering for a greater role within the power structure of the world. Christine Lagarde, the new chief of the IMF, after the mysterious prosecution of Strauss-Kahn and his demise as IMF leader, her first act was to give China a greater role or a senior role in IMF administration. The fund's new chief pledged to give more power to emerging economies, especially China. Min Zhu, a Chinese national who's a special advisor, who was a special advisor to Dominique Strauss-Kahn, is expected to fill the new position as deputy managing director created by Christine Lagarde. Here's what's going on. China's been using the financial weakness of the West with its constant need of bailouts to trade some of her abundant financial reserves for increased power at the tables of Western control. Not that anyone is objecting in the West for strategic safety reasons. Every government seems to be bending over backwards to woo or accommodate the Red Dragon. As I pointed out last week, China secured promises from Europe to not allow criticism of China's abysmal human rights record in exchange for loans to various EU countries. Although China is cash-rich due to a favorable balance of international trade, things are not good inside the country. Now it's China's turn to face the music of bad government debts and rampant inflation. The source of China's current problems dates back to the collapse of the globalist economy in 2008, when, like its Western counterparts, the Chinese government unleashed a flood of cash to stimulate its economy. Much of that money was loans from state-owned banks to local governments, which were supposed to spend all those yuan on new roads, railways, power plants, and other projects. But many of these yuan didn't get where they were supposed to go. It's still not clear exactly where they all went, but this week the Chinese government announced the results of a nationwide audit of 31 provinces and finds out that they're carrying 1.6 trillion worth of loans, and most of them are bad. They went to their friends to make companies which didn't end up producing anything. So it's a big scandal in China. Following the blueprint of economic transformation laid out in the early 80s by communist leader Deng Xiaoping, China has embarked in recent years on a massive spending spree. Inflation is coming with a vengeance in China. Beijing hopes the spending will expand the success economy of coastal cities to the inland region by stitching them together with a vast network of roads, railroads, and high-speed internet. But corruption is everywhere in these roads and these railways and internet. And so most of these places now have either not been completed or they're virtually empty because most of the vehicles are in the major cities and there's hardly any vehicles out in the rural areas. Well, in other news, Cisco Corporation in America helps Chinese suppress dissidents. The communists have always counted on Lenin's dictum that the capitalists would sell us the rope to hang themselves. But Google and Cisco are going one better. They're even helping them design the electronic shackles to control and surveil the people. Senior executives at Cisco work closely with Chinese government security agents to tailor hardware and software that they knew would be used to track, detain, and torture followers of the banned Falun Gong spiritual movement. And it's more of a rebel movement as well. The suit says, filed by Washington-based Human Rights Law Foundation, that by 2007, Cisco and its executives had played a major role in high-level design, implementation, and post-production support of a project codenamed Golden Shield with solutions tailored to isolate, surveil, and suppress dissidents in China. Cisco's collaboration was said to include work on non-standard techniques for redirecting Internet users seeking banned sites by supplying the user with a false reply if their request is for a blocked site, and also identifying and tracking those users so that they could be persecuted later on by China. I mean, this is just unconscionable for American companies to be assisting in this kind of suppression of liberty.
So it reminds me during the Second World War when IBM was over there helping Adolf Hitler design, with their cards and their numbers, the means of tracking all the Jews. American corporations seem to be much more concerned with profit than with principle.
Absolutely. Well, there's also a lot of glowing news about the elections in Thailand, but the same people are in power under new names. It reminds me of what happened in Italy in 1994 when a huge conspiracy was revealed to the public wherein every political party was on the take from powerful mafia interests, lots of kickbacks involved. The government fell, as did all the heads of the major political parties. But within a year, all the parties had reformed and changed their names and figureheads and were back in business. So Tony Carlucci, contributor to the Activist Post, correctly notes that at face value, Thailand has been dealt a horrific blow to the establishment during the July 3rd elections. It was hailed by the foreign press as a historic landslide victory for the people, and a defeat for exiled convicted criminal Thaksin Shinawatра's party. But the victory went to a proxy party for Shinawatra, and who was running the party but his own sister, who won the election and will form the next Thai government, while the media fixates on the fact that Ching Gluk, which is the sister of Shinawatra, or Thaksin Shinawatra, the first female prime minister of Thailand, they fail to mention or even attempt to dispute that she is a virtual unknown just weeks ago and is literally running as a placeholder for her brother. Whenever a totally unknown steps in with big money behind her, you know the fix is in. That's my analysis on Thailand. There's an international brouhaha in Texas over a capital punishment case. It seems like every time someone wants to be executed in a state who's a Mexican national or illegal alien, everybody in the world and the international community and the Democratic administration comes to their rescue. With the execution of a Mexican national on U.S. ground scheduled for Thursday has become something of an international scandal. President Obama and the State Department, no surprise there, and Mexico have all asked Texas for a last-minute reprieve of Humberto Leal, who was convicted in 1995 of the brutal raping and murder of a teenage girl. Now, this is 1995, and he's still alive. These appeals have taken forever. He's had every chance in the world to get legal representation for this, and his appeals are still rejected. But there is a treaty that says that anyone arrested in the U.S. who's an illegal alien has the right to contact the Mexican consul and get legal advice. Critics say Leal, who was raised in the U.S. since he was 2, was never given the option, and in turn watched the jury take 45 minutes to find him guilty of rape and murdering a 16-year-old girl. Congress reportedly has had 3 years to pass a bill supporting the treaty, but did not do it. Hence, it's impossible to pass a bill that would spare Leal unless a stay is ordered, which Governor Perry has refused to do so far. Now, I don't trust Perry, who's a closet globalist, but he often takes the conservative side on issues like this to boast his phony right-wing credentials. Attorney General Eric Holder and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton naturally say that if Texas disregards the treaty, it may have consequences for Americans arrested overseas. But the state of Texas appears to bristle at the idea of a foreign body affecting judgments in the state, even though, predictably, President George W. Bush endorsed the UN ruling. There's no surprise there either. But here's the law. Texas is not bound by a foreign court's ruling. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled in 2008 that the treaty was not binding on the states and that the president does not have the authority to order states to review cases of foreign nationals on death row. Quite true.
Well, they always just want an issue to make, they focus our attention on one issue after another to really take our attention off of the really important issues that threaten the very survival of our nation. But it's all political theater. Go right ahead.
Well, it's interesting. There was a brand new, huge terrorist strike bombing in Iraq. It's hard to believe that the recent bombings in Iraq were timed so carefully so as to give Iraq an excuse to ask American troops to stay. The U.S. government didn't waste any time mingling or reminding the Iraqis that the time was running short for Iraq to ask the U.S. troops to stay.
In fact, we have to ask who benefits from this terrorist attack. Do the Iraqis benefit from it? No, they want to get rid of us. Then who benefits from the attack that's being used as a justification to ask the Americans to stay? Go right ahead.
Yeah, I'm convinced, Stan, that this is a false flag terrorist attack in order to justify American troops staying. The U.S. has no reason or no intention of leaving There are 50,000 troops there in these 4 big American bases. So I think this was a carefully crafted deception.
And of course, Joel, it's so difficult for the average individual to believe that we would actually do something like that. And yet they really need to read Operation Northwood, put forward by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, that suggested killing a lot of Americans to justify an attack on Cuba. I really believe, of course, that the Gulf of Tonkin incident was total deception. It led to the death of 58,000 Americans because they lied about what happened that day. Would they lie what's happening in Iraq? Go right ahead.
Well, the Air Force Times came out with a blockbuster this week. The U.S. is still flying combat missions in Libya. It's utterly amazing that Obama could, with a straight face, claim that America is not engaged in combat in Libya, only playing a supporting role to NATO. But his own AFRICOM, that's the African Command, spokesman says that it isn't true, according to an Air Force Times article on June 30th. Air Force and Navy aircraft, I'm quoting, are still flying hundreds of strike missions over Libya despite the Obama administration's claim that American forces are playing only a limited support role in NATO operations.
Well, maybe, of course, that we're not doing it, but our planes, which have been transferred to NATO, are doing it. I mean,
not absolutely. These are Air Force Navy aircraft, not NATO aircraft.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is incredible. The Air Force Times is an establishment publication. And that's, they're there. Despite the American claims that they're playing only a limited role, they confirmed, and they gave the numbers. They talked about hundreds of them are doing bombing and how many ordnance was dropped since Obama said that. African Command spokesman confirmed Wednesday that since NATO's Operation Unified Protector took over from the American-led operation, the U.S. military has flown hundreds of strike sorties. Previously, Washington had claimed that it was mostly providing intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. So there you have it, from an establishment government source, the Air Force Times, that Obama is lying. We are playing a very active military role in Libya.
And why in heaven's name are we doing it? And why doesn't Congress have the courage to just cut off the funds totally and cut off all Defense Department funds until they stop this foolishness? But nothing's going to happen. We're going to continue. Go ahead.
Yes, it's really true. The neocons are very much ensconced in the Republican Party, and so we're not going to see any change in this warmongering agenda. Hopefully, the only benefit out of this is that as Obama continues to push this war through in Afghanistan, that the Republicans will have to take an anti-war position in the next election. But it won't mean anything. Establishment Republicans will always go along with the neocon agenda once they get into office, just like Obama did.
Well, it's unfortunate we have a one-party system, 2 branches of exactly the same party. Both sides want the war. Both sides want massive deficits. Both sides are going right along with the socialist agenda. But most of all, both sides are pushing the same globalist agenda, which will lead to the destruction of the sovereignty of our nation. These are subversive organizations and subversives running the very essence of our government. We're out of time, Joel. God bless. We'll talk to you tomorrow morning.
Thank you, Stan.
Well, this is Dr. Stan. The city of Joel was just pointing out that the Air Force Times has announced that we, despite the fact that President Obama said that we are not engaged in any active military things over in Libya. We're just doing some support things. The Air Force planes are regular flying sorties and bombing and certainly strafing and doing all the things that the Air Force planes do. And a war, but President Obama says we're not doing, and the Air Force Times says we are. Who should we believe? President Obama wouldn't lie to us, would he? But you're not going to read this, of course, in Time or in Newsweek or the New York Times or the establishment publications, because they're all controlled by the same people. And even Fox is, of course, the conservative wing of the establishment. And if you haven't gotten into the background of how the media is controlled, you really need to realize that both political parties and all of the media are controlled by exactly the same people who control the banks, the military, the corporations, the educational system, and make mockery of our democratic process. And we go to the polls every 4 years and we vote for the candidate of their choice. And of course, one of their two candidates always wins. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this is the time when I need to remind you that my ministry, Radio Liberty, is primarily listener-supported. And if you're in a position to join the Radio Liberty family of supporters, we'd love to have your help, because we'd like to expand the number of stations. We have picked up a couple of stations this last month. Well, we need a lot more. We're almost up to 65 stations or outlets every single week. And people are learning. They're learning about the spiritual battle. So if you'd like to join the Radio Liberty family of supporters, our number is 1-800-544-8927. 1-800-544-8927. And if you can't afford to help us, please pray for Radio Liberty, for our provision and our protection. Well, what you need to do, of course, is read my book, Brotherhood of Darkness, to hear our DVD talks on the Forbidden Secret and on the Dark Secret. They're both posted on our website, but of course you can get them, certainly the DVDs, and then you should get the syllabuses that will give you the information on what's really going on behind the scenes. You need to get Pastor Billy Crone's wonderful DVD sets on the Fearful Creation, the Judged Creation, and the Final Countdown. I think there's 10 or 12 DVDs in most of them. One of them is 8 DVDs, one's 10, I think one's 11 or 12. But you need to have the information so you can discuss intelligently the spiritual significance of so much of what's gone on in the past and how that applies to what's going on today. Because the last thing that the people who control our government want is for you to understand that the Bible is true. After all, everything is done to destroy our belief in Christianity. That's why they took God and prayer and the 10 Commandments out of our schools. They knew exactly what they were doing. They wanted to destroy the Christian foundation of this country because the globalists, the small number of people who control our nation, hate Christianity because they worship a different God. Well, basically, of course, you have not yet seen the DVDs on the Return of the Giants. If you haven't seen the DVDs, certainly I should say the 4 CD set on the Return of the Giants, the 4 CD sets on the Illuminati, and there are actually 2 of them, part 1, part 2. We recommend that for you. If you want to understand Skull and Bones, we have certainly 2 books on that, America's Secret Establishment, and certainly The Secrets of the Tomb. We have a 4-tape set. And then, of course, on the Bilderbergers, we have Alex Jones' excellent DVDs. We'll see the leaders of our country with their hoods and their capes and their candles. Looks just like, of course, that movie Eyes Wide Shut with Tom Cruise. If you haven't seen it, you need to see it, and then you need to see the DVD on the Bilderbergers. And then, of course, please pray for America, and pray for Radio Liberty, our provision and our protection.